Thanks for joining us for the last panel today. I understand that there's some expectation for a fourth show, but about all I can give you, Harvey, is swinging oldies from PBS, and I think that's something you're probably familiar with. I'd like to thank all for the opportunity to speak to you today about this very important issue. I'm pleased to be joined by a very distinguished panel here today. They'll make some brief opening remarks, and then we'll follow up with some prepared questions and then open it up for questions from the audience. During today's conversation, mic drop. You're supposed to do the mic drop at the end.
Just checking to see if you're awake.
Okay. During today's conversation, we hope to leave you with an enhanced understanding of the complexity of this issue, especially when broadened beyond the OPM data breach issue. The growing phenomena of systematic and persistent collection and exploitation of personal information. Much, as you're aware, is still unknown about this problem, including the possible strategic intent of our adversaries and competitors. There are some aspects of this issue that probably cannot be acknowledged in this forum, or at least not confirmed. Suffice it to say that the concerns might range from facilitation of criminal activity to specific intelligence targeting. Others might suppose that the collection and exploitation of such data, along with other sources, provide insight into exploitable opportunities through societal and political analysis. We'll get started with our opening remarks, but I'll throw three things out for the audience to start with, to think in terms of the remarks today as data as currency, data as influence, and data as power. And with that being said, we'll start with Mr. Phalen.
And we are green. Thank you. So three quick things to start with. I've learned three things today. I have a Y chromosome, and so I apparently am the insider threat. There's also been a reference to referring to old movies, so I will refrain from ever using either Blazing Saddles or Airplane in a speech anymore. And lastly, it was out of the room, sadly, I missed sort of the references to this group being sort of rock stars, but you referred to Beatles or Rolling Stones, but hearing the comment that the OPM breach was notorious, I'm thinking Notorious NBIB. Are we good with that? Okay, over to you. No, so getting more serious now. So June of 2015, OPM announced that they had discovered a fairly consequential and massive breach of its data networks and a consequent exfiltration of a significant amount of data relating to the background investigations of federal employees and federal contractors with clearances. And a lot of numbers have been bandied around. You're probably safe with the number Bill mentioned this morning of about 21.5 million people's records. Probably a pretty fair estimate of it. So certainly in response, OPM did one quick thing, is that they offered credit monitoring to all of those 21.5 million people and their offspring. And one would ask sort of why does this make sense, considering the conjecture as to who might have done this thing. I mean, we can speculate. I will argue we probably will speculate as to who did this. But in any circumstance when your data is out there in the wild, credit monitoring is not a bad idea. And so we're doing that, and we'll be doing that for some period of time. But so the question is, what else are we doing? We have a data system that is still existent, the one that was breached. We've done a tremendous amount of work on the front end of it to ensure that the access controls are far better than they might have been in 2014 when the breach began. And I am fairly comfortable that we have the current information system protected as well as it possibly can be. And I personally, for the first time in my life, filled out an electronic equip when I took this job, and am comfortable doing such and putting my information out there. A little bit more on the context of that in a minute. But the second thing is recognizing that we are dealing with a data system that is probably not as efficient as it could be, was built not more than a couple, or maybe more than a couple of years ago. And so we needed to modernize this anyway. And so we're using this as an opportunity to build out a better sort of end-to-end whole-of-government system for capturing the totality of a background investigation from inception to conclusion. and to include all the relevant data where possible that affects somebody throughout their career and their lifetime holding a national security clearance. And we're building this, actually the Defense Department's DISA is building this to our specifications, and a key element of it, besides just making us more efficient at capturing and holding on to data and moving it, is to create a system that is secure for today, will be secure for tomorrow, and as far as we can see into the future, make it flexible enough to maintain that security. Because we understand that this breach was we lost people's, people's trust doing this. We recognize the responsibility we have to keep this data secure for the future. And so that's what we're doing. But it is out there. And so now what? What do we do? What are we thinking about? So OPM joins the ranks with Anthem, with JP Morgan Chase, with Target, with Yahoo, and you can, the list goes on and on. It becomes sort of endless after a while, of organizations that have had data breaches for a variety of different reasons. With most breaches, this one included, nobody stood up and said, hey, we did it, unlike a lot of terrorist claims when they do blow something up. Very few times does somebody jump up and say, we did this. So I think following that again to some of Bill's comments earlier, we can take it sort of as a good point of conjecture that this was a foreign adversary that did this for the OPM data breach. The jury is still out as to what this means. How can this be used? We are all participating in an effort to monitor this and watch and see if what the opportunities might be, and if necessary, take appropriate action to help people in the future with this. For us, sort of that have worked in the cleared business, where I was the day before the breach is kind of where I was after the breach. And that is, we had to worry about foreign contacts. We had to worry about people that might meet up with us, might make contact with us. Certainly if we traveled to any adversary country, we needed to take certain precautions. Those were good pieces of advice before. It's the same good pieces of advice that are out there right now. I mentioned I filled out an EQIP for the first time. What that will tell you is that my personal information was not in OPM's database when it was breached. I never filled out an EQIP. Everything I did is on paper before that. I never did electronic fingerprints. I never got a letter from the director of OPM saying you're in trouble. I did have a Target Red Card. I've had 3 accounts compromised at JP Morgan Chase in 4 years. And that list for me goes on and on. So none of us are immune from this problem. It is a problem that exists for all of us. And so I would say that my best sense of what the long-term impacts of this is that this information in the hands of an adversary might help them learn more about me, might help them get a little bit of an edge on me, might help them sort through data. But all in all, if I take the same precautions tomorrow that I would have taken 3 years ago when traveling, with dealing with my business, with my life, with contacts, I don't think I would do much that would be very different.
Mayor Rose?
So, what?
Yeah. Okay, you can hear me now. Can you hear me now? So what do we do with that? So all of us, clearly, I don't know why he didn't get a letter. I got a letter, and I had every job he ever had, so it's kind of unusual. So what do we do about that? First and foremost, Charlie's going to do all the right things. So I would posit that what you really need to do is to educate your workforce, because the real value of the data is the questions 16 through 21. You know what? It's pretty easy to find out where you've lived, where you've worked, who your friends are, who your references are, even who your neighbors might be. But the reality is the information that many employees were concerned about were the privacy information that historically we take great pains to protect between the government agency and the individual. And as the data was hacked, you have to assume that that privacy information is out there. So what did we do at the time? What will we need to continue to do? Is really educate people on, one, what are smart practices moving forward? What does, travel, or someone inviting you to a conference, or someone asking you to come to a university or a symposium because you're so smart on pick your topic. But more importantly, what do you recommend people do when they are asked that? You know, they can't hide under a rock. Reality is that your social, you know, Dave had said earlier, publicly available media. How many people in this room have a smartphone? If I don't see every hand up, you're all lying. The reality is your data is, as the lawyers have said, every time you click a button, somebody knows some data about you. So data is power, and how people use that data is what we will continue to monitor, what we will need to continue to educate workforces. And to the previous panel, that supply chain and that uncompromised delivery, you know, those of us in aerospace and defense, most of our R&D is done in an unclassified arena. So how do we make our engineers as smart as they can be in an environment where clearly there aren't enough of them, we can't keep them long enough, and the reality is we want them to do it better, faster, cheaper. And there are some ramifications to that, but it is very much, you know, OPM is just one of them. Target, I mean, as Charlie said, they're all over the map, and every day there's yet another one. So the reality is your data is out there, but how do you take that information and make people smarter so that if someone does approach them, what do they do about it? And more importantly, if they are approached, who do they talk to? Because if they're approached and they don't tell anybody, it doesn't help any of us. Whether it is our companies, whether it is our customers, whether it is, you know, how long, the old detect and deter, detect it and deter it as soon as possible. That's the real success here, because you know, clearly Charlie hasn't said, but there's been no concrete evidence that anyone has to date, to my knowledge at this point in time, been targeted as a direct result of this OPM. There's a lot of supposition, there's a lot of, you know, assumptions out there, but there is no thread that says, because of the OPM data hack, you know, Lou Bladel has been targeted to do X. The reality is we're gonna have to deal with this ambiguity for a very long time. And more importantly, it is not just a credit issue. You know, those of us who come from an intelligence background, this is like a gold mine. You know, there are a lot of, you know, intelligence officers who would have spent years, oh, Charlie, you know, spent years trying to collect this information on people. Well, it was open in one fell swoop. So just be aware of that.
Thank you. Lou?
Yeah, so I guess to piggyback on Charlie and Mary Rose's comments, as put my FBI hat back on, if I were an FBI agent in New York and I was able to get this kind of data on any foreign adversary traveling to New York, would we use the information? Absolutely. And there's no doubt that we would, and it would make us maybe a little better on targeting someone, but is it a, you know, a fatal issue? Certainly not. I think that, like Charlie said, yes, it's a problem, but is it something that is overcome just by good security measures? Certainly. I think one of the biggest downsides to the hack was really the perception of people's on giving information back to the government. And so I know I was still in the FBI when the hack occurred, and I know I got the letter, and when I got the next letter saying, give us all your information, we're gonna put a credit lock on you, we're like, well, I don't know about that. So I think that the harm really was the perception that the information wasn't taken care of, and then how do you unwind that? And I think time will heal that. But as far as a counterintelligence threat or a counterintelligence problem, yes, it would make an adversary more capable, but it would still require somebody to want to work for them. And so, you know, yeah, I honestly, I can see why there hasn't been any defined problem yet, and I don't anticipate one coming. If there is going to be somebody that goes to a foreign country that's an adversary that immediately volunteers or works for them, they're going to do it anyway. And so I certainly wouldn't worry about that. But with that said, you know, my role in Ernst Young is we help companies protect information. And so we do that in a way because we want to build faith in the employees and faith into the companies. That's the problem. How do you have faith now in OPM? Or how do you have faith in giving your information or having an insider threat program or having a program that takes data and it's used by government or used by, you know, the corporate heads? And that's would be my downside of what happened would be the cause of that. So that's all I have.
Okay. So in the absence of any probative evidence, okay, that this has been used to harm the United States, I like to borrow a term from a show I watch called Pardon the Interruption. Is this a big deal for the U.S. government, little deal, or no deal?
I think it's a big deal in the sense that we need to renew the faith of the American public that we can protect that information. By and large, that's the biggest piece. I think it is less of a big deal holistically in terms of danger to people. I think the problems that will be encountered will be individuals in the wrong place at the wrong time if this is exploited in some way, shape, or form. But I also believe that an educated individual, if faced with some of this information, and to the stuff both Lou and Mary Rose alluded to, an educated traveler, an educated person in this business will be able to deal with it and turn it back around. So I think the biggest, to me, the biggest deal is restoring what I think needs to be the trust in the American people that we know how to protect this information.
I would agree with Charlie. I think it's all about the credibility.
And the only thing I would add on to that is, I agree, if you're trained and you're going to go overseas, you're not going to take your phone or you're not going to take your laptop. Since I've been in the corporate world for 6 months, it amazes me on how many people still do that, where they'll go with their BlackBerry or their smartphone or their computer, and they won't even think anything of it. And I know how the FBI operated when we were able to get a warrant or we were going to target somebody, what we would do when they would arrive. And so if you go to another country, to think that your smartphone is going to be protected is foolish, and I think that's something that if it's my data that was hacked from OPM, I'm not worried about me so much, but I'm worried about the people that were my verifiers, because I think they're going to be a little less trained and a little less, I guess, alert or aware of, hey, if you go to a certain country, you may have a problem. And so that's where that's where I would say it's I won't say big deal. That's a medium deal, I think, for not necessarily the immediate people, but the couple layers behind.
Okay. So most of us in this room, or a majority of us in the room, are or have held security clearances at some point in our professional lives. So I happen to be one of those, and I have very active social media accounts. I do most of my shopping online. Should I be concerned with the U.S. government's protection of my information in the future, or does it really no longer matter?
I would say that you have to be prudent. You have to be smart about your social media presence. You have to be smarter about if you have children that you allow access to your accounts. And you have to be mindful. But throwing caution to the wind, I wouldn't do that. But I would also not be paranoid. The reality is we live in an environment where everything we do is pretty much a bit in a bite. Whether it is your shopping, whether it is your travel, your business. The reality is you have to be prudent and have some sense of cyber hygiene, which, again and again and again, we see people who demonstrate complete incompetence with things like password one, or the same password for every account they have. For really smart people, they're not very smart all the time. So it is back to that, you have to educate them, and then you have to articulate what the potential ramifications can be.
And most cyber attacks really are basic at the end of the day. And if you look at, the phishing emails and that stuff, my wife works for a private firm, and they did a covert phishing attack on their employees. 85% didn't respond, right? Fantastic, but what about the 15% that did, right? And so that's one of the things that I think people got to understand, that when you see something that looks a little bit off or it just doesn't seem quite right, just don't respond to it. And it goes back to the hygiene issue. Mm-hmm. I still think that cyber is still a low-hanging fruit type exercise. And if you're smart enough just not to click open, you're probably going to be okay. And that's one of the things that you got to continue to, I guess, push. I have 2 teenage sons that are online a lot more than I am, unfortunately. And we are always constantly reminding them, don't open this, don't open that, because the minute they do, it just sets it into motion. It just gets out of control very quickly. The same goes true with your PII, if you were to do something to compromise that.
So we're at a counterintelligence forum today, and so we're sort of looking at this issue through a counterintelligence lens. But Mary Rose, in your opening comments, you said it's not just a credit issue. There's the risk of criminal exploitation here. So what really drives the point home to the people that have had their information compromised that this is a counterintelligence issue? And have we done enough to address it as a counterintelligence issue?
Well, I don't think you can ever do enough. So the reality is that that was 2015. Some chunk of every one of our populations came on board after that. So they don't know anything about it outside what those supervisors, managers, or them, as I call it, the us versus them. They're smart, and they're very smart, but they don't recognize the vulnerability there. And they sometimes, you always have to just continue to educate and educate. How many times do people click on, one character difference? How many repeat offenders do we have on spear phishing attacks? How many people get the IRS call at home and somebody actually returns the phone call? Now, yes, that these days isn't more a different population, but they're going after the weakest link. And so I don't think that you can ever stop educating. Today we're talking about the OPM breach. Tomorrow it'll be something else. Tomorrow it'll be the result of the articles you're reading in the newspaper about people coming back into the US and DHS is making them open their computers and taking their passwords. I mean, that's caused a hue and cry in industry right now in terms of, oh my God, we have to have throwaway laptops. Well, it doesn't matter because it's still connected to the network called Northrop Grumman. So the real issue is how do you make people smart enough to only take the data they need if they're traveling internationally, and more importantly, their behavior every day. Because in the press of business, people go to the fastest moment.
And the other thing to add on is the attackers are going to change their methods also. Where we used to get a phishing email that was very poor English, a lot of misspellings. Obviously, that's changing now where the phishing emails are much more sophisticated. I got one recently from what looked like my insurance company, and it was spot on. And I was like, well, why would they email me? And that's and so I think you always have to change also. So you may. If you see, some email that has a lot of misspellings, you're not going to open that. Obviously, it makes perfect sense. But when they start getting closer to what it should look like, then you got to think for a second: would they really send that to me? And sometimes you just pick up the phone and you call, say, "Would you guys send me an email like this?" And the answer is always no. Like an email from the IRS or email like that, it just doesn't work that way. And so I think that you have to be vigilant about it because as the defense gets a little bit more sophisticated, the offense is going to change their playbook also, and it's just a constant reminder. And I think for the big data, that's something that we don't want to give them the layup type cases. You want to be able to make it harder, and keep their offense changing, I guess.
Yeah, I would triple that bet on this thing, because if you look at data breaches in general, they are largely the result of somebody making a mistake. If you look at the OPM breach, it was somebody having one credential compromised. And the result was the adversary was able to sort of swim upstream through the network and get to what they needed. But it was just some one person making a mistake. Similar event, not related to breach of tons of data, but look what happened to Sony with the same sort of event happening. And in that case, it wasn't loss of a lot of PII, although presumably there was stuff in there, but things that tremendously embarrassed that company. And in companies probably less financially stable, could have been a significant impact, put them out of business. And so I know there was an earlier discussion on delivering products uncompromised. This is a big piece of this thing. We put a lot of stock in our security programs, determining whether somebody is trustworthy enough to get inside the wire, making sure the wire itself is secure, the physical wire is secure, and nobody can get in without permission to get in. And then thirdly, all of the barriers we put out on the perimeters of our information systems to make sure bad people or wrong people can't get into it. But we let these folks in every day, and I get on my computer in my office and I become the access control officer. And so making me smart about what my responsibilities are and continuing to make me smart, as Mary Rose points out, about what my responsibilities are is really a key to success in this area.
So there was a point in time, I mean, the OPM breach occurred in 2015. And so we've had a couple of years now. And there was probably a point in time here, it struck me as an irony, that perhaps whatever adversary may have taken the information may have had more of a holistic view of our cleared population that even the U.S. government has. So assuming that could have been true at a point in time, how proactive should security or counterintelligence be in identifying exceptionally high-risk personnel for specific education, training, and awareness?
You know, one of the things that I do in my current role is we go out and talk with companies about insider threat, obviously. But to kind of talk to them about who has the jobs that have the most important information. And okay, it's usually not a lot. I mean, you can define whether it's a 5-division company, maybe 2 divisions you need to worry about, or a part of a division, or whatever it may be. But then what's the protocol? And all of us went through the 5-year reinvestigation all the time for our clearances. Many companies will hire somebody and they will never look at the employees again. And when you step back for a second, you're like, okay, you just hire somebody, they say they can turn off the power grid. Wouldn't we want to know a little bit more about them? Or wouldn't we want to make sure that we're up to speed on what is going on exactly? I mean, I know it's a little different than somebody hacking in or whatever, but when I was in the Bureau, we worked economic espionage. About half of our economic espionage cases were insider derived. I mean, the insider did it, but the insider may have given their access to somebody, or they had a friend that they allowed them in. And that's something you gotta constantly remind people of, hey, listen, you are going to be a target. How are you going to play defense? And sometimes the defense is better played by the company on setting up a protocol that's repeatable, that is consistent for everyone, that doesn't target anybody, but there's an actual protocol around it. And I think that's a much better way of securing your information.
So I'd sort of add that for folks that end up compromising things, and this is part of the discussion we had earlier, a significantly high volume are people that volunteered. They woke up and said, I'm going to go do something stupid. I'm going to betray my country. They weren't coerced into this thing. So that's what all the insider threat discussion earlier today was about. That's not what this, to me, is about. What this really is about is that there is some part of the population that may inadvertently walk into a situation and have if their data may be part of this in some way, shape, or form. Our role should be to make sure that individual who might walk into that situation understands what an approach looks like, what an attempted compromise looks like, what it means to be put in a bad place. I think Lou probably have more information on this than I do, but I think a good example is a guy named Glenn Duffy Shriver, is it? Mm-hmm. Who goes to school in China and ends up being compromised as thoroughly as one could possibly imagine. Some of that may be volunteered, some of that was something he walked into. And I know the Bureau did a fairly credible job putting together a movie, not a feature-length movie, and certainly not as good as Blazing Saddles, but a movie talking about this. And with the idea that this would help people that are going into those sort of programs understand what this might look like.
That's a really good point. And there is the training movie is called Game of Pawns. And when we released the movie, we ran it through a couple study groups first. Our first group was the National Higher Education Advisory Board, and which was a board that the FBI had with a bunch of college professors. We showed them the movie, and what happened was in China, Glenn Duffy Shriver answered an ad in the paper that really said, hey, listen, we're interested in what America thinks about the Chinese. So he says, I want to help you with this. I'll write papers for you, whatever. So what it was a way to kind of draw him in and become really a co-optee is really what he was. And so we showed the movie to the heads of the schools. And we were thinking this is the best movie. The FBI is so smart. This is unbelievable. Well, of course, the school folks are like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. You guys are profiling this country, these kids. They just want to learn. What's wrong with you guys? And we're like, okay, whoops. Let's maybe reset this. And I think it's all about the culture, right? And so, the Bureau is obviously a law and order group. And when we wanted to show, hey, this is what a threat is, we didn't do a good job on explaining the entire case. We just showed them the movie. And then when we would explain it to them, like, hey, we're trying to help these kids make sure they don't fall into this trap. This is why we want to address them. Then it was a much better conversation. But I think it's all about setting the stage, right? How do you train folks that are at risk? Mm-hmm. And once we figured that out and realized, hey, listen, let's explain why or how these kids are going to be targeted, then the schools are much more willing to engage with us they didn't want us to target their people. They wanted us to kind of help them educate them. And I think that was the best way of doing it. And it goes to Charlie's point. You know, our role is how do you educate people from not becoming an unwitting victim? And that's a very good example of trying to do that.
Well, and the other piece of that is many of us have very different populations. There are very few colleges today, and there are very few industries that are not a global footprint. And so to think that we can be a US and others is delusional. So we really need to think about what does that global footprint look like? What does every kid coming out of college who usually has at least one interim outside of the United States to understand the culture is how do we educate that, and then how do we address that risk? Risks should never be 100%. There are always people who are higher on the scale, who have, you know, as I call it, the crown jewels piece of the equation, and every company identifies that. We all have risk departments for those sole purposes. We have insurance liability. The biggest way to ruin a company is to go after their risk, to reputation branding. And so you have to look at that all the time, and it changes depending upon your population, or depending upon your contract, or depending upon your customer, or your delivery. So a lot of that is, to Lou's point, is it's not, kids shouldn't go overseas, and we shouldn't have them in our workforce. The reality is, how do we make them smarter to understand what they bring to the table? All of us have a global footprint, and the reality is we have to stop treating our global entities as if they're, you know, like, you know, I don't know who said it this morning, foreign national visitors. They're employees of the company. We have to address them as employees of the company, and then how do we work the, you know, government requirements, the ITAR requirements, you pick it. But it's all about every level of risk is at a different aperture, and there are some that are a lot lower than others, and there are some that you would not think would be high at all, but they have access to every space. And so what do you do about that? All your lab space, all your equipment. If you lost $1 million piece of equipment, what would that have an impact to your corporation? So you got to think through all of those scenarios, and everybody has to participate.
Okay, understanding that there's additional analysis to be conducted, primarily, you know, looking at this from how we would exploit this sort of data. Is it possible to extrapolate even at this point that such breaches are used for broader purposes than individual targeting or credit or criminal enterprise gains? And what I'm speaking about here is sort of how advertisers will intentionally do micro-targeting to influence decisions on purchases. Is that something that any of the panel members have considered with regard to this particular breach?
My take on it would be who took the information. So, I mean, if it were, you know, a store in the mall, sure. If it were a foreign government, I think that they would be a little bit more, I guess, they want to hold that data themselves and then use it on they fit. So to me, that wouldn't be a concern on an OPM style breach. But it is a concern. You know, I know you can walk down the mall and wherever you happen to walk into whatever store, it's going to register on your phone. Hey, this is a guy that's interested in, you know, Eddie Bauer. This is a guy interested in something else. You know, that's a lot of information out there, and it goes back to the same thing. Who's holding all this information, and is there any security protocols around it? That would be my concern with it. This specific discussion, I don't know that I would worry about that information going for, you know, some sort of targeting, I guess, economically. But, you know, there's a lot of information out there that certainly could be used for that.
You have a comment?
I think one could possibly conjecture, if an adversary had it, they could use it to target some sort of a spear phishing approach at your place of business. Would make the most likely sense. But that's the same hygiene problem we have with any of these kinds of attacks. The other is, do I suddenly have a new friend on the internet? And again, this goes back to hygiene. I would be wary of any new friend I have on the internet anyway, should I have any friends on the internet.
You know, I went to Kenya for the embassy bombings in the late 90s, and one of our security guys was really funny. He's like, If you're not good looking in America, you're not good looking in Kenya. And
If you are, worry.
and if you are,
But you're
you need
really
to worry
handsome in
about
Moscow.
that.
And if you are, worry.
Exactly.
Okay, so we can get to some audience questions here. I've got one last one here. What would you see the government industry, what would you like to see government and or industry do differently to protect data?
Defer to you guys at the moment.
I think for government, they got to get back into the business of having people trust it. You know, I think that was a pretty big misfire. And I think that just comes with time. I think that I would assume that Charlie will be very successful. I think he'll get it all handled. And that will build the confidence for industry, maybe some transparency on what they're doing with it. You know, I think when you build any security protocol with a private company, you need to make sure the employees are ahead of that and they know what's going on. Because if it's done in a way that they hear about it later, I think that you really have a very likely chance of making them suspicious of what's going on. If you're clear up front, you know, I would think that it'd be a very good, really good system to get started.
So I would also say we've got to get the trust and credibility back, and trust, credibility, and capacity, because right now all three are struggling at the moment. And then from absolutely agree with Lou, if you are not communicating to the population when you're setting up these programs, that lack of communication will come back to, cause you some question in later times.
I recognize that this was a large faux pas and that rebuilding confidence is absolutely critical. Those of you who know me know I don't like to make promises I can't keep. I will tell you we are doing our utmost to maintain the security of the data that we have today and that is on file, and we'll continue that level of effort for tomorrow. And I think the confidence will have to come as people start to believe that. I can't stand up here with my hands on my hips and say, trust me.
I'm the government.
Again. Yeah. You have a question, sir?
He has two fingers
Harvey's
up.
chomping.
And I know what that means.
One of the interesting terms that has not come up all day, which is kind of fascinating, is an issue a lot of us are focusing on, which is encryption. Mm-hmm. And what is the panel's sense about the whole encryption debate that we're engaged in between Silicon Valley and the government, and the point that many of us were stunned that the data was not encrypted, and that we have had a recent Vault 7 issue with another encryption issue for the data. And I'm kind of curious, given the collective wisdom in the panel, where you all stand on that.
I'll answer from my perspective. When I was in the FBI, I ran the Snowden investigation, and Snowden encrypted all the data that he took. And the FBI spent years trying to decrypt it or crack it. And if you want to keep your data and you want to keep it secure, encrypt it. Because if you have a certain level of encryption, we're not going to crack it. On the Silicon Valley question, should there be a back door? That's what you're asking? I guess it depends on how you see the world. And I use my phone for everything. I have, for phone calls, but I also have all my passwords and all that kind of stuff in there. All right, so if I do something and I do something that's not quite enough to get a warrant for me, should somebody be able to have a back door into my phone? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. But I think as long as we stay with the normal search warrant protocol, I don't have a problem with it. Like the iPhone 5C that was in San Bernardino. Couldn't get into it. It was owned by the state, I believe. If you try to get into an Apple 3 times, it'll burn everything. And so should there have been a backdoor for that? The guy's dead. How do you get a warrant for that? Man, that's a really hard problem to solve. I kind of Director Comey will come out all the time and talk about going dark. And he's right about that. And there used to be a time where there wasn't that concern about you can't get into a phone and how do you get into them now. I think it's a great conversation, and I think however it works itself out, I hope that it's a well thought through process, because I understand the privacy issues of it, but I also understand the law enforcement reason why you'd want to get into that. And it's a different world now. I mean, there's so much data in a phone. It's not just about who's calling whom and when they called. It's also about what's been saved. And so the calls, to me, I don't think that there should be a backdoor to that part. The problem is, how do you only get the calls and not the other data on the phone? And so to me, that would be the main question. So I'm not answering your question, and I'm sorry, but for me, it's two different things. The phone back and forth, absolutely. The data that's held in a phone, man, that's getting awfully close to searching your house, and from my perspective.
So from a data encryption standpoint, clearly, I can see both the access point and the non-access point. I also think that data encryption in the last 10 years has been utilized when convenient and not for the press of business. So remember, when the press of business drives, that's just another set of procedures that have to be done. There is not a company in this room who doesn't have encryption requirements for sending certain level of data. Running an insider threat program, I can tell you, people don't utilize it. So I think that until we get to a point of practice with rapidity, regularity, consistency, and standards, and there are some accountability for not, and then to the whole point of, at what expense? Clearly having been in another side of the equation during the Snowden adventure, Brian Smith's in the back of the room. He saw me more than he ever wanted to see me during that tenure. So part of this is, what's the balance with national security? And I think that's an extraordinarily difficult policy discussion that, has to be played out.
So just to add, I'm a fan of encryption, but as the sole countermeasure, probably not. Lou mentioned, should you build a backdoor into the encryption? It turns out you need a front door in order for people to actually get the data and do something with it. So there's a sort of inherent vulnerability you have to deal with. So the encryption is good. By itself is not the only panacea. We need to also have good access controls in the front end and be very knowledgeable about what's happening. And then lastly, because I believe it is inevitable in any system that I own, that somebody will try to get in and may actually get in at some point, is we have to have enough network monitoring capability and activity monitoring capability to see if there's an active shooter on the network and be able to deal with it in a hurry.
I think it was Lou that just said about what to do when you go overseas. I'm just wondering, proactively now, how worried are we about using our personal email or about using our social media or about bringing our phone with us or whatever, the technology going forward when you're traveling outside the U.S.?
My take on traveling outside the U.S. is never take your smartphone. Okay, then what do you do about that? Then you go get a track phone and just have that number while you're gone. Because if you take your smartphone overseas and say you're of interest to whatever country you're going to, say a hostile country, I wouldn't worry about going to friendly Five Eye. But if you go to a hostile country and you are of interest to them, well, they can stop you at the border and do a search, and during that search, they can mirror your phone very quickly and get all your information. And so that goes with a laptop too. Does everyone want to have a throwdown laptop? I mean, I think that's kind of a little excessive, but you gotta take a good look at where you're going and what the risk levels are and what you have possession of, meaning information. Any foreign adversary, keyword adversary, I would be very cautious and take it. I wouldn't personally take my cell phone or my smartphone with me, nor would I take my own computer. The emails, there's a lot of built-in security on your Yahoo account or whatever the different accounts you have. Even with that, they get hacked all the time. And I think that those are almost like plain sight type issues. But your corporate stuff, your more personal stuff, I'd be pretty cautious with than just something, a random Yahoo account or something like that. Or whatever account, Google or whatever.
There's a question over here. There you go.
This is a little bit off the course of encryption, but I'm curious to your perspectives, both from the industry side and government side, of what our current mix of using human capital and literal bodies to be tracking and monitoring insider threats and frankly, any kind of cyber threat. And what our current course is for migrating more towards tools and systems and automation to do that rather than physical people. And do you see that being a rapid migration, a slow migration, and what are the benefits and challenges to moving more towards tools and automation versus humans doing that?
So I would tell you that Northrop Grumman uses primarily tools and then uses the humans for the analytical judgment piece of the equation. To, one of the previous panels, it does take a village because you cannot make one decision about, behavior that a tool may collect without the HR, the law department, the security people, the programmatic people, such that you have transparency to the employee for what action you are taking. Now, over time, as Doug said, any insider threat program has to evolve, and they will all evolve. Tools get better, people get better, no matter how good the mousetrap is, somebody's gonna figure a way to work around the mousetrap. So if you aren't always jumping into the next evolution of what am I missing, what are behaviors telling me, what am I, when you're a company, as big as ours, we have people all over the globe. So, what are you looking at, and is it the right data to be looking at? And what are the trends telling you? Insider threat programs are strictly a data informer to tell you what you need to do next. So, but you can't do it with just humans. And anybody who tells you that is, well, it's very hard with humans. And
Sorry.
The team I'm on in EY, we speak with businesses all the time. And our general, you got to build a holistic program. And I think that Doug and his team at Lockheed has done a great job, just to pick on Doug. But a small piece of that is the technology. The real piece is you put it all together and then you get that information to somebody that can evaluate it. The machines can put it all into a dashboard for you, and you can get your baseline of the company, and then you'll look for the anomalies. But then some humans got to look at that anomaly and say, hey, listen, here's something that makes sense, or hey, maybe we have a problem here. But you can't do that anymore with the amount of data that's out there without having some sort of tool to kind of consolidate it all and put it into a usable format.
Yeah, to sort of take the opposite, not opposite approach, but the other end of that equation, Mary Rose says you can't do it with just humans. You can't do it without humans. Mm-hmm. And so what the tools do is allow you to collect information, but if you take the sort of human behavior versus protecting a network or protecting a facility, facilities largely follow the laws of physics. Information systems largely are ones and zeros. Humans are just all over the map. And so what we're really trying to find out is where are you, not you personally, but any of you, on that spectrum between Charles Manson and Mother Teresa. And hopefully this tool will give us some insights into it, and we can. But a human's got to really get out there and make that judgment and decide what to do about it.
I would probably add, just from stepping out of the role of moderator for a second. We've been doing our program for about 3 years. We solve two problems. We solve for the data problem, we solve for the person problem. And you have to keep those in balance. On the data side of the house, it's taken us almost 3 years to graduate from what just happened to what we think is getting ready to happen. And now we're just getting insight into what is not happening that we should expect to happen with individual behavior on the network. So I think I would echo colleagues here that it's both, but you have to solve for two problem sets at the same time, data and people.
I'm Jim from Raytheon. My professional business is pretty close to the front edge of the cyber stuff, so I respect the opinion of you guys on the OPM breach. I'm curious, have you ever given thought to, I received a letter myself, and I've thought I detected a much more thoughtful approach to the phishing emails in my personal case. And I was wondering if you ever considered offering people who had been affected by the breach, the people who got the letters, an email address to forward those things to, so you could take a look at them and see what might be in there as a potential program.
I don't think we did. I'll have to go back and check because I wasn't there at the time, but I think that's a good idea if we haven't.
one back there.
And then one over there.
One over here and one back.
And we got one over here.
Thank you. You mentioned human behavior is important, continuous education, and the evolving threat. I'd like to point out that I have the premier 21st century theft protection system on my car. I drive a stick. So getting back to the insider threat and cyber and educating our people about these technologies that are evolving, how much of it is training them on our controls and our defenses, how much of it is training it on offensive tradecraft that they're going to come up against, and how much of it is training them on how does that stuff I use day to day actually work? Because all three of those things to me seem to be interrelated on it, so it seems very hollow that some of the training I get on, well, here's our controls, here's our policies, do this, but without that other context. Unfortunately, what we don't want to do is we don't want to create, 21.5 million computer scientists to do it. So is there any balancing that you can help with?
I think, if I'm following your question, most people aren't that interested in figuring out how the computer works, to be honest with you. But the hard part is most people want their computer to work quickly, and they don't care what that takes. And so sometimes I think that the best way to kind of describe it is whoever's making sure your system's working, you might want to understand what they're about, okay? Because they're going to have the access to how everything works, and they can turn things on and off and that. So personally, I would probably start with a system that, I don't say you got to have enhanced monitoring on every systems admin, but I think that there's a few key jobs in every corporation or every agency that you probably want to take a good look at. I'm old enough not to know how the computer works, and I certainly am old enough not to care. All right, but I want my systems to work, and my AV support is my 15-year-old at home, and so.
AV.
Yeah, right. That's I guess technical support, right? So I guess, but that's kind of the point. I mean, the younger generation is so good at this stuff, and we have to kind of embrace them, but also make sure they understand that, hey, this is very important. There's responsibilities with that knowledge. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that, but most people aren't that dialed into the computers.
So I heard a little bit different. So your question to me was the balance between how do we educate them on doing the smart things within our walls? How do we educate them on the smart things that if they're traveling to understand what anomalous behavior might look like and not yet make them all, what I would call, James Bond, because they're not going to be James Bond. And more importantly, why? So it really is different dependent upon, one, the individual, because some people, to Lou's point, they just want to go to work and they want that computer to work every day. Two, some people who you have your BD guys or your global guys who travel all the time, you want them a whole lot smarter because these are people who don't like to pack a bag. They want to ship the bag. Well, that bag gets visited by lots of people. So what do they put in that bag? So it's really different based upon the population, and that varies widely. So it is a balance, but I don't think there's one size fits all.
I'd actually add one more thought into that thing, because I think you've hit on the concept I've always sort of ascribed as something I needed to do for people who were security officers and security professionals, and that is, if you're going to enforce the rules, you need to understand what the rules are, and you need to understand why the rules are. And I think to your point is, to the folks that have to follow the rules that are out there, we need to do the same thing. They need to know what those rules are, but we need to make it clear to them why those rules are. And I would expect enforcement and compliance would be more effective and more reliable if they know why we're asking them to do this, whatever stupid thing it is we've asked them to do from a security rule standpoint.
Sure, my name is Khalil Jackson. So I come from the perspective of a software engineer that started as a teenager who spent a bunch of years on Wall Street and later joined the service. So we talked a lot about implicitly and explicitly about people, process, and technology today. Because of what certainly people and technology, how they are the fundamental tenets or of how we do counterintelligence and the umbrella of things under that. Can you just discuss or address when it comes to data loss prevention, intellectual property, things like that, how do we address the challenges that we face today with a growing population of very talented technologists and manage that loyalty, to whatever company, incentivize that loyalty, and ensure that talent management happens the right way, proactively?
One of the first things, when I was in the Bureau, we worked economic espionage. One of the first things that the companies had to do was show that they wanted to protect that information. So the first step is if you have some sort of technology in your company and 50,000 people know about it, then you're not protecting it. You have to put some sort of wall around it. And what's a reasonable wall? Where does that start? I think that's the first step, okay? Because if it's important, then a company needs to show that it's important. And they can't say, hey, I just lost XYZ, that's proprietary. And then the first question the FBI is going to ask is, well, how many people know about that? And so I think there's lots of steps that you have to go through to get to where you are. Like, okay, first you got to decide what's important, okay? And then once you've decided what's important, then how do you start protecting that? And then you set your protocols accordingly. On how do you, I guess, educate the technologists? I mean, I don't know.
So are you talking about like the engendering loyalty? So the moving every 18 months. So one of the things, to Lou's point, is, absolutely correct. Any company has to determine what is my important intellectual property and what am I doing about that? And that's very different than any classified material. It may feed into it, but it's very different. And then how do you articulate that to your workforce? What are the expectations of protecting that? And then more importantly, from a standpoint of what I would call a mobile environment, we live in a world where people want to move every 18 months or every couple of years because they want to be challenged. So, every company handles it a little differently in terms of how do I incentivize people for professional development. The government probably does it a lot better in some ways because they move you every couple of years, so you never really can get bored. In private industry, you can move from program to program, but some people don't have that. I would tell you that's a big piece of what private industry is really focusing on in the what I call war on talent, because everybody wants the talent and they want to keep them as long as possible. It's the classic, if I'm going to invest in you, I want to keep you as long as possible. And so that struggle is right now, how do we do that? Is it money? Is it, other cool projects? Is it, the latest capture? So I think it's an evolving picture right at the moment.
I think you'd agree. It's generational too. I think, like our generation, we all went to work for somebody for 20 years and stayed, and now that just doesn't seem to exist anymore.
It only seemed like 120. Right. But so to your point, though, I mean, one of the big fads, maybe to impolite a term, but a lot of companies are doing surveys with their employees about engagement, whether it's the Q12 or whatever the next version of the Q12 is. And the theory behind this, and I think there's a lot of validity to it, although how they get to the answer is sort of awkward, is that an engaged employee is one who believes that this company is worth working for and worth protecting and doing all these right things. And that engagement isn't really based on money. It's engaged in the sense of is this part of my family and how do I get there? And the companies that strive to do that probably have a much better rate of people that are compliant with the regulations and the protections that need to be, because these people feel like they're part of the organization. I don't know that there's any magic bullet for how to engage these folks. Everybody who will give you that test will then give you a program for how to then get your employees more engaged. But my experience has been both in government and industry where this has worked is it becomes very mechanical and pro forma, and I'm not sure it really has that impact. And I'm looking at some of my colleagues from my past lives in the audience out here, and I wonder how they're thinking about this as well. But anyway, I'll be quiet now.
I'd add
one over here.
I want to add one thing to that. So our company, we're deeply engaged with employee engagement. And it really has come, it is an antidote to those counterproductive work behaviors that we talked about earlier today, if you do it right. And for us, and for me, it kind of comes down to three things. Does the employee have a say? has expectations being created for them with regards to how they're to protect company information? Are they treated fairly, and are they communicated with frequently? And I know that's 4 instead of 3, but it's really, you know, we see it as the absolute antidote to that counterproductive working behavior, the employment engagements. So there was a question here.
Thank you. Ms. Carrie Whidden talks about a concept of, or a vision of modern vetting, kind of a continuous evaluation process, and this background investigation business evolving towards that. DISA, in the meantime, has some challenge to build something on the pretty near term. And so my question is how NBIB, the NBIB organization is working with DISA NBIS and to both achieve that near-term challenge that they have and you have, and then also achieve perhaps a longer-term vision that aligns with OD&I.
So my first reaction was, Carrie who? I'm just kidding. We all know Carrie well. So, and in fact, I would agree and have agreed for a long time with where hers and a lot of other folks' shared vision is on the idea of continuous evaluation, continuous vetting, continuous something. You heard a lot of those themes earlier today, which is pay more attention to an individual as they evolve through the system, as opposed to taking these sort of sounding things every 5 years or 10 years, whatever the periodicity is to it. And so with that in mind, as we have been engaging with DISA to build NBIS, the National Background Investigation System, which is at our requirement and to our specs, as we develop the specs, we are bringing in, to the extent we can, whole of government. We're taking 2 BPR studies that were done. One we did with OPM and NBIB prior to NBIB's existence, and then a separate one which was done by DOD, looking at the background investigation programs and matching them up and seeing some remarkable similarities. And these form the basis for how we need to think about how a process works today, how it can be improved, and what does the future look like, and building something for the future that will withstand any change in the direction that we take with a process. So whether it becomes continuous vetting, or we still have 5-year periodic reinvestigations, or some variant in between, or something completely off the map, this thing needs to be able to collect, move, store, and make useful the data that we've collected to what is ultimately, after we put all this stuff together and all this man hours that go into this and data collection, it's to put something in front of some guy to say, okay, here's the story on Charlie, do you trust him? And what we're trying to build is something that will inform that decision, no matter what the front end looks like, the collection system looks like, and what periodicity it may have, or how we even think about it. So I'm not sure that answers it, but we're looking to make it as flexible as we can, rather than try to build it to the 1947 process, which is before the Blazing Saddles movie.
Are there any other questions? Okay, I've got one that I meant to ask a little bit earlier, and this is primarily for Charlie. And it's an opportunity to either confirm something or deny something, I guess.
Or no.
Or punt. No,
My lawyer's over here.
Okay. Okay. So is there a nexus between the OPM breach and clearance backlog? And what? And clearance backlog.
So the nexus for the clearance, the more proximate cause of the backlog in clearances is not the OPM data breach. That was about a 6-week impact on intake, 6 to 8 weeks, depending what the number was. The real impact on the OPM backlog is the demise of the contract with USIS several months earlier, sometime in 2014, which effectively over a fairly short period of time reduced our capacity to do investigations by about 60%.
And the reason I ask that is often that those two issues get conflated.
Right.
You know. So.
No, as bad as the breach was in terms of reputational and all that justifiable stuff, it really had very little impact on the backlog.
Okay. Are there any other questions from the audience? Is there anything that the panel would like to wrap up and say?
I thank you for your time and your attention, and I think again, give us some time. We will earn your trust again in terms of protecting the information, and at the same time, we will hopefully earn your trust in getting your folks cleared on a more timely basis. Thanks.
Mary Rose?
Nope.
Nope.
Okay. Give our panel a round.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to beg your indulgence for about 3 more minutes, so bear with us. I know one of the things Charlie failed to say was that he's going to have the new process in place and the backlog taken care of by 1 June, right? Okay, so again, thanks to this panel, but bigger thanks to all of our speakers and our moderators. Let's give them a hand again. I can't emphasize enough that if you've ever tried to do this sort of a thing, you just can't do it without sponsors. So I want to thank again Leidos, Northrop Grumman, IBM, Raytheon, PwC, Mantech, and Red Owl. Thank you. We've already said thanks to Charlie and Kathy, and especially Doug Thomas for kind of the intellectual capital that goes into putting something like this together, so thank you again. But I also want to give a very special thanks to Larry Hanauer. It goes sight unseen by most folks, but Larry has put in an extraordinary amount of effort into making sure everything was right, everybody was here, the content was right. He got a lot of good advice from Doug, but Larry put an awful lot of blood, sweat, and tears into making this right, so thanks, Larry. Okay, I hope it's been a useful day for you. It has been for us. We want your feedback. But anytime we get into thinking about where we need to go, every once in a while we need to think about where we've been. One of the things that I think would be appropriate for us to think about here for a minute would be that we lost a real American patriot last week. I think most of you know that we lost Ambassador Hugh Montgomery. He was an original member of OSS, but more importantly for us, he was kind of the father, if you will, of the way we think in a modern way about counterintelligence. So it's somebody we ought to think about today. I always thought Charlie Allen, one of my real heroes, must have been the longest serving CIA officer ever at 47 years. But Ambassador Montgomery makes him look like a shirker because he was there for 63 years. But I thought it would be appropriate for Charlie to share a couple of thoughts about Ambassador Montgomery.
We knew at some point we would lose Hugh. I knew him for some decades, as well as some of my colleagues who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He joined the 82nd Airborne in 1942, and on the night of 5-6 June 1944, he parachuted into Normandy. He was so good at linguistics, he was spotted by the OSS and then spent the rest of the war behind German lines working with partisans. His OSS unit helped liberate Buchenwald. He still had, the last time I had lunch with him, he said, I still have the SS flag that they gave me, those survivors whom he liberated out of gratitude. Hugh worked in the Berlin Tunnel, and he worked in Moscow. He worked in a number of other places, spending several tours in Italy. He spoke 7 languages, had working knowledge of 8 more. He served, as Randy Fort knows, as Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. He also served as deputy to the U.S. mission to the UN, where he had special duties, and he carried the rank of ambassador in those duties, and I've talked to him about those, which will remain classified. And then he served as special assistant to several directors of Central Intelligence and to the DCIA. He retired in 2014. Some of us were at that historic moment. And as we go forth to help defend the country and what Bill Evanina said this morning, the need for patriotism and dedication. Hugh Montgomery reflected those great qualities. And I want to thank everyone for putting up with a few seconds. And please remember Hugh Montgomery as we go forth.
Okay, so with that, we're done. If you're not involved in INSA already, I hope you will be. I hope to see you at future events, and please be safe and well going home.